I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And you guys, this is one of my favorite book club events we've ever done. And you know I really like our book club events. Jess Kidd is the author of The Night Ship. She's also the author of, wait for it, Things in Jars, which one of our monthly picks early on, and also Mr. Flood's Last Resort. There are a couple of other books too, but those are, this is kind of the triumvirate, Jess. We're not ignoring the other books, I promise you. Shannon DeVito is the director of books here at Barnes & Noble, and I'm so excited to see both of my favorite humans. This is going to be so good, you guys. So, couple of things though before we start. There are going to be spoilers in this conversation. Straight up, this is a book club discussion. There are spoilers. The other thing is too, if you would like to add your questions to the Q&A module, you can add them there. You can also just drop them in the chat. I'm going to be looking at both places while this conversation happens. I promise I'm really good at checking both while we talk. But before we get really going, Shannon, I know why we picked The Night Ship for book club. Yeah. And I know you share my love of Things in Jars, but you want to tell the audience why we picked Night Ship for book club?
Yes. So besides celebrating Jess Kidd and her amazing writing just constantly, I wanted to bring attention to this just gem of a historical novel. I had no idea about the Batavia before reading this, and it really made me want to go and research just a lot more. It was an intoxicating story. It was raw and revealing sides of humanity that I just thought was ripe for book club discussion. And the fact that it's set in two very different time periods, but two very similar child experiences of grief and trauma and just the insanity of humanity. How could we not pick it? So that is why I thought it absolutely had to be our pick for the spooky, scary month of October.
Okay, Jess, you and I have talked about some of this before, but I want to start with a different question. Yeah. How does it feel to have The Night Ship out in the world and see what readers' responses have been like? Because it's out in the UK, it's out in the US. Lots of folks everywhere are reading this book right now.
It is, and I just love this kind of like stroking. Yeah, it is wonderful actually, because I think it was a while in my head while I worked out how to tell it, and it's such a big story, so to see it out in the world is wonderful, and that really is the point when a story comes alive for me, when I have these wonderful conversations with yourself and just get the reader's feedback. So that's kind of why I do it, really.
Okay, are you a writer who thinks about the reader while you're doing the work, or are you thinking about the story first and just letting the story unfurl?
I think increasingly I think about the reader, just because what I hear from the reader often informs the choices that I make. I mean, obviously I get lost in the story, I get lost in the world, and sort of world building is what I'm really, really interested in doing. But as a reader, I like to be kind of taken into a world. And so I really have that in mind. There's a kind of an element of experience. And I think I try to do that with Things in Jars, like with the idea of the sensational novel and the kind of really getting a reader response with that. So I suppose a similar kind of thing happened with The Night Ship. So, so I think, yeah, increasingly it's the feedback that I get. And also it's just fascinating for me how people can just read very different things into a novel and to pick out things that they really love. So when it starts speaking to people, that's when I'm like, oh, that's such a relief. There's always that kind of tentative moment where you think, I love these characters, I love this world, but is everyone else going to feel the same?
Hey, Shannon, do you have a favorite piece or a favorite character from The Night Ship? I mean, the thing that you're still carrying around, because you read this book months ago.
Yeah, it's almost a year ago. Because I asked very early for this one. But honestly, I think it's the tortoise in Kiddo. Like, he's just so sour-faced and perfect, and just, the friend that Gil needs. It's just, I loved him. So
okay, so if Enkidu is your way into the story, then I am going to bring up the Epic of Gilgamesh right now, because I almost fell off my chair when I realized that Gil's name was not Gilbert, that it was in fact Gilgamesh. So there might be some folks who are not fully aware of the Epic of Gilgamesh, but it's kind of in there with the Odyssey and the Iliad. It's sitting in that kind of epic poem, historical, maybe some of it's true, maybe some of it's not, we don't really know. But would you tell us about your relationship with the Epic of Gilgamesh, please, Jess?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's a great epic story. It's very ancient, Mesopotamian, and it's what drew me to it, I'd had it in my mind for a long time, and it was just this idea of friendship, but also this kind of this uncertainty of life, and also this kind of unwillingness. It follows this sort of king who has lots of lessons to learn, and so it's really about his inability to accept death, and this becomes a central part for Gil and the kind of letting go process, really. So for me, it sort of resonated in that way, but also Enkidu is such a fabulous name for a tortoise, and often I don't really know the characters are going to appear until they kind of literally walk towards me in my imagination. So I had this moment when Enkidu kind of potted up, and I thought, yeah, okay, a tortoise in this bleak this island off the coast of Western Australia. Yeah, okay, here he comes. So I like to have a creature for every book, and I think when I find that creature, then I feel comfortable.
Is there a character that really, these characters walk up to you and kind of speak their mind and then establish themselves in the book? Is there one that you love the most within this book?
It's such a tough thing, isn't it? Because it's like trying to make you to decide between your children or something like that. But I'd say Micah and Gil really feel to me both. I mean, I feel like I almost couldn't tell this story without both of them. Originally, it was just going to be Micah and the experiences on board the Batavia in 1629, but as I was doing my research, Gil emerged, and it became more rounded. So I love the kind of the duality of it and the two different perspectives. So for me, they almost form a whole, if that makes sense, although they're two very separate characters. But really, it was a joy to discover most of the people, not all the people that populate the book, because obviously we have got a psychopath in there. So, but it was quite wonderful to discover all of the characters.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions that are basically similar riffs from two different attendees. There's Jennifer, who's asking, what made you want to write this story? Because I feel like we're sort of moving our way into that piece of the conversation. And also Teresa D is wondering what inspired you. So essentially we're looking at two pieces of the same question, but I think I'm going to put them together and we're going to answer both of them at the same time.
It's a really good question. I was actually casting around for another story to do. I knew I wanted to write another historical novel because I've loved the research element of that. And a friend actually bought me this story and said, have you heard of this? You've got to write this. This is just incredible story. And I started looking into it. I'd never heard of the Batavia story. And as I started looking into it, two things became really, really apparent: that there wasn't a huge amount of fiction written on the subject, but also the fact that it felt like a really big epic story. And how would I frame it? How would I tell it? So those two considerations sort of drove me on. I'd put it to my wonderful publishers, first of all, because I thought I hadn't even been to Australia when I heard this story. But it really did get its hooks into me. And I just felt like I was ready for that challenge. I mean, obviously, having written historical novels before, it felt like a good grounding. But this was a completely different world. And I think there were so many elements that drew me to this. Just the remarkable story, and that's kind of extremity of human behavior as well. So it was just it was an initial, oh, that sounds interesting. Then it just would not let me go.
Okay, one of the things you and I talked about when you were on the show, Jess, is your structure. And this novel feels because you're wrestling with two different timelines. And, Mika and Gil and their perspectives, we are going to come back to that because that's a larger part of the conversation. But I just want to talk about handling time and the two timelines, because, 1628 and 1989, and 1989 feels like it may as well have been 1956 at this point. But and Sally M has a version of this question as well. And she's just wondering, is it hard to handle two timelines? And it can't be easy, but wow, you make it look really super easy.
Oh, thank you, Sally. Yeah, it's a really a tricky one, because we're dealing with two different time periods, but also time works differently in each of these periods. Micah's time is over a longer period of time, from setting sail to the wreck, and Gil's is a shorter period of time. But I felt that it was really important to show this kind of complete story, because as I was doing my research, I really found that it was the ongoing story of the Batavia that was really fascinating. I knew there was a slight risk of chopping between the two time periods, and especially as I kind of speed up towards the end. But I also felt that if I could make each strand compelling enough, that the reader would follow me in that. And so that was kind of an early decision in terms of structure. But obviously you have these kind of mirrorings that took a little bit of time to kind of feel satisfying to me, because I didn't want an outright mirroring. I wanted it to be a little bit subtle here and there, but just satisfying enough, really. So we have kind of things that link them through time, and the kind of physical objects of the hagstone or the witchstone felt like an anchor to me, anchoring them into the island. So with the setting and the kind of physical objects as an anchor, I felt I could move around time a bit more. But I mean, I think the challenge also was to research the two separate time periods, because I had to pick a time when the fishers were still using the island, and also going back a little way allowed me to get a bit nostalgic. So that was two kind of separate worlds again to research.
Okay, and let's talk about the Batavias path for a second, because Patty is asking what the path was, and I think there are some folks who might not realize we were headed to Indonesia via Australia from the Netherlands.
That's right. So she set sail from the Netherlands, and she was using the route that was suggested by the VOC, so the Dutch East India Company. But what was happening was, on board, tensions were growing. And as she was moving around the Cape, all these various things were happening. So the two very strong male personalities on board, the upper merchant and the skipper, were both kind of vying for power, I suppose. What happened eventually is that she was supposed to travel up to modern day Indonesia, which is Batavia at the time, but she was off course. So the skipper was using dead reckoning, because this was before the time. I mean, the sailors were incredibly skilled. They could read the coastline. They could read the various sort of conditions at sea, but what they didn't have was a really foolproof way of working out longitude. So the skipper, with all this various stuff, and a mutiny was brewing, so he had his hands full, up to no good. So he miscalculated and was far too far off course, and this is when the ship collided with the reef.
Okay, Shannon, is your internet behaving any better? You seem like you're more steady than you were a second ago, but
I'm slightly more steady. It's like I'm balancing on a surfboard. You guys are in and out, and I think I'm getting most of it.
Okay.
But
okay. Well,
yeah, so we're going to keep on keeping on.
Just so you know, technology is not totally being our friend today. So, because Shannon, we've been texting in the background like, hey, are you back? So Shannon, though, I want to talk to you, though, because we see a lot of historical fiction. Obviously, we're booksellers. We see a lot of this. There's a big moment. But I will say, for me as a reader, I had a connection to The Night Ship that I don't often have to historical fiction, because, I mean, for me, it was the atmosphere. It's gothic-y, it's overwhelming, it's dark, it's a little claustrophobic, and wow, the smells on that ship, woof, I cannot imagine.
It was visceral.
Yeah,
reading it was a visceral experience. Yeah,
it was an experience, and I think that's really what I'm trying to get at. But did you have a moment where you were like, oi, 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 how did we get here? What just happened? I had a couple moments on the ship where I was like,
a few that were just so dark, where I was just like, oh, but honestly, it made me empathize even more with the characters, because it's like, if I'm feeling this uncomfortable or this sad or this grief stricken because of what's happening in the trauma on the boat, then imagine what the character is going through. And it honestly, I think, made me connect that much more. And I think it is the thread. I think, Jess, you do a really good job with the characters themselves. I love that that world building is kind of where you start with building the world, but it's really the characters that bring you into this very gothic, eerie, but true type of world that you create. So I think that's where the difference is with the types of historical fiction we see. It's just a whole kind of genre brand on its own, because it is based around these true events, but it's through the lens of these characters that are just absolutely unforgettable. And it's these visceral experiences where you're just like, I just dry heaved a little bit because that sounds awful, which is great. Like,
okay, and Kira Mounts wants to know, was the eel real?
yeah.
Well, I think you have to make your just judgment on that, Kira. I mean, I'm delighted to hear, but not about the dry retching. But I think there's always a kind of physicality in the research that I do, and I was fortunate enough to be able to run all over a replica boat, a replica ship of the Batavia, which really helped me to visualize it. And I think bringing you into that world through the senses, and also the way a child experiences the world, because quite early on, I thought, I can't really tell this story from an adult point of view. I felt like I needed to have those guides into the world and have that kind of curiosity and that fluidity a child has in order to be able to negotiate the world. So I think using it, the children to bring you into that world, because it's a really kind of gritty place. And I was very inspired by things like Pan's Labyrinth, that deal with a real historical, very difficult moment, but through children. And there's an element of play and exploration in that, and just that kind of way that children potentially experience trauma in quite a different way to adults. So that felt to me that through their eyes we could perhaps see more. And I suppose it's going back to that duality as well, so the duality of time, but also the duality of child adult world. So it sort of happens on that level as well for me.
The adults are a little feral. The adults don't know they're feral, but they're feral. And, we frequently think of children, and especially in this case, these two children, I mean, there is no school, there's no sort of structure. There's kind of like, well, I'm here and no one knows what to do with me. And the adults are really feral. And you've got Micah, who's sort of doing her own thing and figuring out how to make a world and how to find her place in the world. And Jess, I know I said this to you when we talked before, but Gil really is, for me, a ghost in his own life. He doesn't know what's going on. And obviously he's grieving his mother. We couldn't talk about this when we did the show, but wow, what a backstory to Gil. What a backstory to Gil. And I have been looking forward to talking to you about this, because, I mean, we don't really teach kids how to handle grief to begin with. And Gil's got nothing but grief from minute one until the very end of this book.
Necessity to handle it. Yeah.
I mean, he's 9. He's 9. You gave all of the things to the 9-year-old Jess.
Okay, poor Gil, I love him as well. No, I mean, I think what you said about the ghost in his own life is a wonderful thing, and that really did get me thinking. I mean, I suppose with me, I feel that Gil is quite isolated. He's dealing with a lot of things on his own. I mean, as a child, I come from a very big Irish family, and so there were a lot of funerals and wakes and things like that, and it was a community process. So any bereavement was in the context of a community, and in both the children's lives we're looking at a sort of a certain breakdown of community as well, and hopefully a sense of as well as a breakdown, people looking to rebuild families, rebuild communities too. So there's a kind of I wanted to show those extremes of human behavior for bad and for good. So with Gil, he's sort of been left to his own devices to process this traumatic happening, and he's sort of defaulted to denial, which was again like the Gilgamesh idea that we talked about on the outset, which is, how do you deal with something as impossible as grief and death? I mean, even as an adult, it's hard to process. So how would this small boy do it? And also, I think with Gil, he already is an outsider. So he's already kind of a little bit cut off from the world. So really, he's kind of approaching it in his own way, really.
So, and I know I'm not the only person who's thinking this right now, but was Gil's story the hardest part of the night ship for you, or was there a moment where you just kind of went, whoa, how did I get here? And actually, who Yeah, Sydney Crane. What was the hardest part about writing this book? So maybe it was a moment, maybe it was a storyline, but let's talk about the icky bits.
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, there's always feels like a responsibility in any book you start off, and you might find that you want a character to fulfill a certain purpose, and that doesn't seem to be the way. I know a
Right,
lot of writers talk about that.
right.
And this kind of sense of writing so you can see where you're going, but I think there is a moment where you're like, do I have to follow this? Like, there's a sense of following them down a rabbit hole often, when you set out to tell a story. I mean, I think that the hardest part of writing this book was the fact that I've woven together real people in
Mm-hmm.
Micah's time, in the
Yeah.
time of the Batavia shipwreck. And there felt like a huge responsibility in a way, because going through the records that we have, and the research that we have, I had very little on some people, but maybe just like a nickname or their job on board the ship, and that was enough with Holdfast to kind of base a character. And Smirt, the cabin boy, did exist.
Right.
So that was really tough, and also getting a sense of how each of these people died. So it was, how would I incorporate that, but also at the same time feeling very strongly that I wanted to tell this story in some way.
Okay, let's switch to craft for a second. We understand the basic structure of the book. We understand how we got here. But Jess, you have a master's in writing, you have a PhD in writing. This is your fourth novel for adults, and there's also a children's book. And I know you're working on two more books, which we will talk about towards the end of this because we're very excited and I'm curious about both of them. But let's talk about craft for a second, because here we are. We're not only are you talking about two separate times, 1628 and 1989, you're also talking about how Micah and Gil interact with time differently, the adults in their worlds. Time is a slippery, slippery thing in the night ship. But if you lose control of time as the writer, then you have a bunch of us saying, huh, what just happened here? Which obviously we've read the night ship, we know that doesn't happen, but can we talk about how we construct that kind of reading experience? Because that's not a tiny thing to do.
Yeah, there were a lot of considerations. I mean, plotting, first of all, Micah's journey and the points
Mm-hmm.
on there and where that could potentially meet with Gil's. But then also, I sometimes wanted to subvert that a little bit. So I
Mm-hmm.
didn't necessarily want things directly sort of mirrored. But I think maybe you touched on this idea that where you have a strong character, you'll follow them. And that's what I really feel as a reader, where I have a strong character, whether they're likable or unlikable, or sort of a bit of everything, hopefully,
Mm-hmm.
I will follow them, even to uncomfortable places and even through time. So I was hoping that by having, I suppose, these sort of real pockets of time that were meaningful to each child would do that. I mean, I think the mirroring really helped in a way to kind of keep me on track. So with certain elements like the dead mothers and the absent fathers, and the fact that they were sort of trying to remake their families as they went
Right.
along, really helped me to find it. But it was also really important to me that they were kind of different enough. I think structurally also towards the end, I made the decision to switch between them very fast. And so the chapters get shorter. This isn't unusual for me. I think I've done this in every book.
Yeah.
I've slightly had the longer chapters to the beginning, and I'm doing it again with these two. And then I go sort of shorter. I think this is really, I started off writing flash fiction, so very, very short fiction, short stories. And I love that form. And so I try to use that to give a sense of, especially Micah's time, because what I was finding writing it was to try and kind of illuminate it in short bursts, because to write more kind of didn't work. It was so intense. That I felt like this would kind of better reflect the experiences as they went along, really, and hopefully kind of pick up the pace towards the end, but not too much. So there were lots of it did feel like I was taking an awful lot of risks as I was writing it. Thank heavens for Enkidu. That's all I can say, because I think really he just carries the whole thing. So
love him so much. But it is, I love the structure of the shorter towards the end, because you've built so much that it's that much more impactful and propulsive. When it is, you're saying everything you need to say and kind of getting it across in a very momentous, like, it's fantastic. And it makes you like talk about page turning all the way. I read this in one sitting because I'm a lunatic, but it's amazing. Yeah.
But that's kind of how it feels for Micah and Gil, though. I mean, they're suddenly learning everything, and when you're little, you have no sense of time. I mean, every single one of us knows this. We've all been kids, and your concept of time, there is no concept of time when you're a kid. You just have no idea. So this whole speeding up, it makes perfect sense, because for them, it's like suddenly there's a wall of information that's about to crash down on their heads. And how do you figure that out, especially when the adults aren't really there to explain it to you? And not because they don't want to, it's because they kind of don't have the capacity, and everyone's figuring it out. I mean, this is a world where the adults actually don't have answers.
Absolutely. And I think that's where you end up having this, what I brought in, the idea of folklore and a myth, to try and kind of add in another layer of meaning, because it's also trying to find, a child will try and find meaning for themselves if they're not kind of given that meaning. And so by bringing in, I mean, I read quite early on about the idea of the bunyip as a way to give shape to fear, and I just love this idea that they would kind of call forth these terrible creatures from the deep in order, their depths, really, I suppose, in order to try and navigate these like treacherous times for them. So but I think what I was also trying to get across with the real sort of historical story of the Batavia, there were extremes of human behavior. So there were acts of immense bravery and compassion, but there were also terrible crimes happening. And this felt really interesting to me, because also these communities are kind of pressure cookers. They're really these are adults put under pressure, and as you're saying, they might not actually have the capacity to help the children, to help them deal with what they're going through, because everyone's kind of just doing their own thing to try and survive. So this was kind of the interest of how you write. The people around them might not necessarily be evil or bad, all of them, but they're just human. And so it's kind of looking at that.
And in some ways, it's easier to believe in the boogeyman than it is to believe that your fellow man is not what you would like them to be or would hope them to be. It's sometimes it's just easier to think there's a monster under the bed, and suddenly all of the stuff that makes your teeth itch makes a lot more sense and is a lot easier to process. And I mean, I think kids have this amazing capacity to figure out what stories they need to tell themselves and when they need to tell themselves, and maybe when they need to stop too. I think it all depends on the kid. Hey, can we talk about writing process for a second? Because Lisa has very patiently been waiting to hear about your process. I mean, are you sitting down every morning and doing X number of words, X number of pages? Are you the person who looks at the last sentence you wrote the day before and you go back and build off of that? Like, let's talk about Jess Kidd, the writer.
Oh, well, Lisa, that's a good question. I mean, I don't give myself a certain number of words to write. I never do that, because I'm far too rebellious. So I would just give up. But what I look for is to kind of get in the zone. And when I get in the zone, I can just carry on writing. I mean, I think anyone who writes will tell you that there are times where you just have to kind of let things brew a bit, but then there are the times when you're kind of much more productive. I tend to write every single day without fail. And I used to teach writing with my PhD and everything, and I found like a few things really helpful. Was just to do a little bit every day and just try and take the pressure off, because I think one of the biggest things that anyone fights against is kind of perfectionism, and to my mind, there isn't really a place for that. It's more about experimenting. It's more about finding the story. I think also I was fortunate in having more of a kind of oral storytelling background. I was in a family with a lot of very strong storytellers. and not a huge amount of books. So I suppose that kind of helped me in a way, just say, okay, I trick myself every day. I'm just telling a story. It's all I'm doing. It's easy peasy. So that's the kind of thing I do. But really, there are a few things that I will need to do when I'm writing a kind of a first draft. I need a lot of quiet and kind of peace, but then I can edit sort of pretty much anywhere. And I mean, some of the things I do are just keep notebooks. I've got a very poor memory, so I tend to write everything down, and just keep a little notebook, and just anything that I'm also very nosy. So anything I come across or overhear, I will write down and just keep that for later. So that, I mean, I suppose like every writer has their own tricks to get in, but I generally find that once you sit down, I think also finishing when you're like ahead is a really good thing. So when you're finishing when you want to carry on is a good practice too.
Okay, and the flip side of that, Caitlin Triskopoulos, and Caitlin, I hope I'm saying your last name properly, is wondering if you have any tricks for beating writer's block.
The terrible writer's block. Again, I think like for a lot of people I've worked with, that feels like it's born from perfectionism, this idea that you have to polish something before you can move on. And my late father was an artist, and he taught me to kind of when you're drawing like life drawing, you just draw the whole of the figure in a circle. You keep going around. You don't work anything up too much, and then you go back later and keep polishing. So there's a sense of that for writer's block can often be, I have to get this right before I move on. So for my mind is adding an element of kind of, I suppose, curiosity or even playfulness to it. So it doesn't have to be perfect. You just get it down, get the words down, and that sometimes does help. I think also maybe sort of tricking yourself into starting writing is a good thing. Like, maybe I'll just look over these notes. Maybe I'll look over these ideas I had. But I'd say the top one for a writer's block that I found is just doing a little bit every day. Even if you just say 10 minutes, because sometimes that can turn into a bit longer.
Yeah, booksellers actually write a lot of copy. I know that sounds a little counterintuitive, but we spend a lot of time putting words on paper. And sometimes, honestly, you just barf out a draft. That's all, like all you can do is, especially if you're writing on deadline and it's just like, okay, I just have to, and then you can go back. You can fix a lot of things with editing and rewriting. You can fix a lot.
Editing and adjectives.
It's just rewriting is a beautiful, beautiful thing, but it is much easier to rewrite than it is to actually. And I realize we're talking about copy versus a novel. Please don't misunderstand me. I am not conflating what we do with what Jess does. However, they kind of go hand in hand. But ultimately, just put the words on the page, read everything and put the words on the page, and then go from there. Ellen Morton has an interesting question here, though. In Things in Jars and The Night Ship, you explore strong emotional connections between people who ultimately can't be together. In both books, it's thrilling and redemptive and heartbreaking. What leads you to explore that space of letting go or being separated from important people in our lives?
Oh, that's such a good question.
Great question.
That's a really good question. I suppose, I mean, some of it might come from my background. As I say, I came from a very big family, and quite early on, I suppose, I wasn't ever kind of protected from the realities of life, I suppose you would say. So from a very young child, I was always aware of this kind of leaving of people and the kind of, I suppose, saying goodbye, these kind of partings and things like that. So a lot of the kind of characters that I write about go through that. I suppose it's a sense of a rite of passage, but I'm always really interested in how people connect or don't connect. And a lot of the time in my work, you have these kind of quite unusual friendships between people that you think, well, how, you know, it might be intergenerational, might be, you know, these kind of rebuilt families, I suppose, all through the various books, really. So I suppose I'm looking often at outsiders as well, and I think that's not unusual for writers to take that point of view. because you have a certain sense of defamiliarization. If you're writing someone outside anything, you're looking at it with kind of fresh eyes, I suppose. So there is that kind of element in all my work. And I suppose also there's an element of this kind of land of the living, land of the dead, and the supernatural element that comes in as well. That's sometimes so I can have an extra cast of characters, if I'm honest, because I like making characters. But sometimes it's also about looking at how people see the world and in all its complexity, and trying to find a way to, I suppose, create or understand that complexity that anyone has in looking at the things that happen to them.
Okay, and speaking of complexity, Stephen Caprios, I hope I'm saying your last name properly, Stephen, I'm sorry if I'm not. There seems to have been a turning point starting in chapter 38 when Gil acted upon an impulse to exact revenge for the Malfeasors' attack on his beloved Endicu. So were there alternate endings for this piece? What if Gil had simply chosen to leave Mikey alone?
That's a really interesting question, and that was actually quite difficult for me to write, because I didn't want it to feel out of Gil's character, but I wanted to have a sense that, I suppose, what he's doing is trying to have retribution in the way that he thinks other children would do it.
Right.
So he can't sort of retaliate against these children. He doesn't feel powerful enough to do that, so he takes another path. So I suppose it's this idea of what kind of behavior is he learning. I think there's a scene where he watches the kids play, watches Mike and his brother play, and he doesn't understand the rules of that game. He's been around his mother, he's been around adults more than children, and so he can't work out the rules of the children's world. And so I think with his actions towards Mikey, there's a sense of that he doesn't actually know how to deal with this terrible attack on his friend. And so you kind of see him figuring it out through this process, and also seeing that Gil has great compassion, really. It's just the sense that he is so hurt by the situation and the losses that he's had to bear through.
Yeah, that for me as a reader felt like sort of the culmination of all of the things that had been happening to Gil. I mean, a lot happens to that 9-year-old, and it just, I literally felt like it was his breaking point, and he was just kind of like, you know what, no one is helping me, no one is explaining anything to me, I'm getting yelled at, I don't even know why I'm getting yelled at, everyone's a lunatic, and now I'm going to throw a punch. And it goes from there. I think he, as sweet a kid as he is, I think every human being has their limits, and I think our tiny 9-year-old found his limit. And you know, certainly the turtle, I mean, it's his buddy, it's his best friend, he doesn't know what to do without his turtle. Hey, we are bumping up though on time, because time is a terrible master sometimes. But Jess, I'm not the only person who's dying to know how there was a cozy crime novel that is a Jess Kidd cozy crime novel, so it's not one of those cozies. And also then something you were hinting at that sort of had a whole mythological sort of standing to it. So has one overtaken the other? Are you writing both still? What is happening here, and when might we see something new to read?
Oh, well, I'm writing them both sort of simultaneously, which thankfully
What?
yeah. But thankfully they're quite different worlds, and I love the characters, because I think with anything, I mean, just talking about the night ship is just such a delight, and because I loved the characters, and I think that's always the kind of sadness that you have when you finish a book. I mean, happy when it's out in the world and readers are giving you feedback, but that you can't be with those characters anymore. So you have the initial stage, which is just the starting of the book, when you feel like you're sort of on top of a roller coaster and it's just poised, and they're just keeping you there as long as possible, but then you can find the characters and you're all right. So they're two very different worlds. One's a cozy crime, and so I've had to sort of kind of learn the rules of behavior for that, and then try and subvert as many as possible, and with a female detective as well. So she's been a lot of fun, and something drawn from Greek mythology, which also does go back to my Irish roots as well. So and that's been incredible challenge, but also a great deal of fun. So to try and imagine these very different worlds.
We can be patient. We can be patient. I mean, I'm speaking on behalf of Shannon here, but we can be patient. I'm just, no one's in danger of running out of things to read. It's just we quite like reading what you write. Okay, Shannon, any
We
last
really do.
words? Yeah, any last words before we let everyone run back to the world? But I mean, I would rather hang out with the two of you for the rest of our days, but we
Just that this is,
do.
worth a reread. Honestly, I started
Yep.
rereading this last week just because I wanted to revisit the characters, and I think it's so much richer a second time around. And our edition has beautiful blue edges, which I think is just, it's gorgeous. So thank you for spending your time with us. It's just such a pleasure to talk to an author whom I love and revere so much.
And hey, BNN Book Club people, The Cloisters is out now. We are going to have book club December, the 2nd December, second Tuesday in December, excuse me. I should know this date off the top of my head. I will be joining you from Los Angeles. Shannon will be joining you from New York. And our author, Shannon, I'm not sure where the author is. So the three of us will be from all over, but it will be excellent. So come hang out with us. As you can see, we're not boring. Jess, it was so great to see you again. Thank you for being you and writing these books, because you're the bomb, lady. It's so great to see you. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Jess. Thank you, audience. We'll see you all later. Bye, guys.